Roland, I always enjoy talking about the world of art with you. You have a feel for it and also a theoretical understanding of it, and I appreciate that very much. I'm interested in art from the viewpoint of the spiritual life and how it can help us to grow spiritually. I'm thinking of that whole category of beauty and so on. We often associate the spiritual life with duty. There's this law, and I'm going to keep it, and I'm going to work hard at it, or heavy responsibility, I'm going to meet my responsibilities, or even I'm going to become a good person, I'm going to develop my virtues, and so on, which I think is a more enlightened way. But still, you begin to sense the limit of all of that. There's a famous theologian in the modern world, often thought of as a neoconservative, Hans Urs von Balthasar, who wrote a multi-volume series called The Glory of the Lord. And his major idea was to make his central category not truth, as often in the modern world, or not goodness, but beauty, to center his whole theological system around the question of beauty and to point out the importance of the aesthetic experience in the spiritual life. And so that's the direction that I'm interested in going in, the spiritual life and the arts and how they enable us to do that. And my slant is to say, well, how will they help us to worship better, to become better prayers? And when I say that, I begin to think right away of our problem of feeling self-contained. I can walk through a lot of days and forget my prayer, or people can take things for granted and never say thank you to God for them, or we can think we're totally autonomous people. And that really is a very limited way of trying to live humanly, and it really does impede the spiritual life. There's no doubt about that.
I remember in Dostoevsky in his diary at one point defined human beings as ungrateful animals. He must have had a bad day when he wrote that, but there's a lot of truth in it.
Ungrateful animals.
Yeah, I think he said in the sexist way, man is an ungrateful animal, but but there is a lot of truth in that. There's another theologian that comes to mind. You mentioned von Balthasar, going back to the early 1600s. St. Francis de Sales, who is the patron of my religious order, wrote a magnificent work called A Treatise on the Love of God. Surely one of the deepest statements about God ever written. The very first chapter is on the subject of beauty. That's how he begins. And he makes the point that our aesthetic experience of beauty and our ability to see that in nature and in art and surrounding us is one of the principal ways of going to God, who is eternal beauty and infinite beauty. And every time we encounter that in some way here on earth, it's like a mirror into eternity.
I'm thinking of St. Francis of Assisi, I think, who had the same idea, who earlier spoke about the beautiful things of this world not taking us away from God, but being steps on a ladder which would allow you to ascend to God, who was really, again, the source of beauty. So maybe throughout our tradition, if we look back more carefully, we could find a lot of thinkers who have understood the importance of beauty as a vital category for spiritual growth.
Yeah, there have been religious traditions that have denied that. I think of Jansenism and Puritanism and others that try to get rid of the material and really deny the body and deny matter. And I think of a woman that I remember reading about some years ago who was deeply involved in the Jansenist kind of thing. And she was the abbess of a monastery in France at Port Royal, Mère Angélique Arnaud. And in her monastery, she had all the flowers taken out. She had all the colored curtains, or anything that brought life to that place. And she said that basically what she wanted to do was to have an atmosphere so drab and so ugly that the sisters who lived in that monastery would hate it, and then their thoughts would be on the next world. And for me, that is a spirituality so atrocious and so distant from what my own that it's hard for me to comprehend that kind of mentality.
Well, your founder, St. Francis de Sales, would be at 180 degrees from that, wouldn't he?
Well, as a matter of fact, he wrote letters with Mother Angelique and tried to convert her.
Oh, really?
It didn't work.
I mean, he recognized that
yes.
And wanted her to see things a little differently.
Yeah.
That's interesting. But I mean, it points out again the value of the aesthetic experience in moving us to spiritual growth and to break us out of the kind of self-contained notion that can dominate our lives. And I think beauty has that power.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm thinking about that happening, of course, in the world of nature. I think many people do get that feeling that when they're out in nature, they're in God's church somehow, that they have a feel for it, or people who live with concrete all the time want to get away from it and go camping and so on. And I think very often it is a matter of recreating the spirit. People might not say that. They say, I got to get away, or I'm fed up with this, or I need a change of pace. But what effectively happens very often, I think, is that the spirit soars a bit, that something is brought to life again, that we get a feel once more for the source of all the beauty, as the great saints have talked about them.
I think both nature and the world of art can do that, because to look at a mountain, like the Teton Mountains, which are so magnificent at Yellowstone, or the Rockies, you see the hand of God there. But then in a great painting, or in a great symphony or whatever, the human artist is the mirror of the divine creator. And you find in the experience of arts, too, what is beautiful. And suddenly you come into contact, I think, ultimately with God. And so every experience of beauty is spiritual, it seems to me.
Yes, and so that takes us to the world of the artist, and the job of the artist to disclose this larger world, sometimes to point out the distance between how we are living and the way human existence is structured in relationship to how God might want it to be, what the ideal society would look like. So again, in the biblical material, we get this sense of distance very often that the prophets have to point out to us, that the world isn't as it ought to be. We're not faithful to the covenant, and therefore we must change our ways, be converted, turn around, and move in a proper direction. So the biblical prophets do that, but also, I guess, the artists functioning open up that larger world to us. And maybe they let the heart soar a bit, help us to see how it ought to be. Somehow I'm thinking right now about weddings. Weddings have a special emotional quality to them, and usually the couple paints an ideal picture. In other words, they've moved into some sort of dream world at this point, and it's a world of beauty, it's a world of possibility, it's a world in which the heart soars. Now, it's very easy to sit back and be cynical about that, especially those of us who do marriage counseling and know how easily that goes badly, or married couples who have been through divorces. But there is something about the moment of beauty that has to have a word. I know I find myself sometimes saying in homilies, but we got to give expression here to this idealism, because it's telling us about human possibilities. It's telling us about what can be. It's opening up some larger world to us, even though it might have a tinge of unreality and be overly dreamy and out of touch with life as it really is. Still, it's opening up something. And what it is reminding us, I think, in one sense at least, of God. God is present in the soaring of the heart. God is the one that's behind the world when it looks more beautiful and looks a bit brighter, especially when love takes us over in that way.
You find that theme very powerfully in the letters of Vincent van Gogh to his brother Theo. I just recently read the entire collection, and he develops that theme very powerfully, that every experience of love is an experience of God. And that goes for human love also, that it mirrors the eternal love. And in his paintings, he said that's what he was trying to do, to this ministry of the paintbrush, where he actually spoke to people through those images, which talked about love and about God.
Now, when we think about this opening up the world of worship, I mean, and to lead us to prayer, really, a prayerful kind of experience, it seems like genuine contact with beauty has that possibility of sort of making an almost an awesome experience. I mean, I think people maybe in hearing a magnificent concert, I think always say when the concert's really great, sometimes people at the end will almost spontaneously stand up. Yes. And I was at the ballet in Moscow back a ways, and there was at the end this just sort of spontaneous standing up, and the little kids in the audience all rushed forward. I suppose it's just a custom there, and it probably happens all the time, but then they stood right up in front of the stage, awestruck, like, wow, this is something. I mean, beautiful, and they're clapping like crazy, and they're looking up into the faces as they take their bows, and you sense something of this, the ballet, beautiful, powerful, physical movement, poetry, and all of that, and it had caught them up and moved them, and maybe the look on their faces said something I would translate like prayerfulness, like awesomeness that has gone on, like thank you for this marvelous thing, like something deep going on within.
Well, you know, that happened in Toledo recently. The Kirov Academy Ballet was here, one of the great ballet schools in the world, and gave 2 performances in Toledo at the Masonic, and I went the second night to it, and there were 80 young performances, all of them 20 years old or younger, but the absolute and total dedication of those young people, you know, their lives so completely involved with what they did on the stage. That is exactly what happened in Toledo, where an audience spontaneously rose to its feet and the people near the stage rushed forward. And it was exhilarating, to use that word about art that we use sometimes, to see the dedication, to see the beauty. I think you wrote an essay once on sports and your love about it, and you made the point that a really great pitcher or a baseball team or any great athlete gives you a sense of the transcendent, that when the limitations of the human body and all that, that all of those are mastered, and the athlete pitches a no-hitter. You know, that it's a spiritual thing, really. It's something about the transcendental there. And the same thing with ballet dancers, who are great athletes also, or any great artist who overcomes the limitations that are placed on human beings in time and space and so on. And suddenly, somehow, they break through all of that to the transcendent. That is deeply moving and deeply spiritual.
And very akin to what we call prayer. I mean, prayer has something to do with an appreciation of the Creator, a sense of the presence of the one who's running the whole show and who's behind it all. I think it leads. There's always the question about how the aesthetic experience relates to the religious experience, and some have said want to make it, well, that's one compartment. There's religion and then there's art. Well, I don't really think that's a good way to thinking about it. I like the word dimensions better. There's a religious dimension to life which suffuses everything. It's a part of everything we do. You can have a religious sense of things on the golf course or at the ballet or while at work. And I think the aesthetic experience, while not exactly the same thing, has characteristics akin to the religious experience, and also is better described as a dimension of life rather than as one region. In other words, you can have an aesthetic experience of a beautifully cooked meal, or of a marvelously tended lawn, or of a house that is in order, or of a craftsman, a carpenter who makes things well, or the ballerina, the violinist. The aesthetic experience can occur in many different ways, and I think opens up this larger world that we want to name the mystery, and I want to point to as God.
Well, there are those who would say that the mystical experience means this direct apprehension of God in some way, you know, that you know God, however that happens directly. And then people like the psychologist Otto Rank earlier in this century, who wrote a lot about aesthetics and all that, is very careful to make the distinction that the aesthetic experience is analogous but not the same thing. But I'm not so sure about that, and I'm also not sure I can put this into words. But I think that some of the experiences of music that I have had, and some of the other arts too, which are very deep and very intense and very profound, are an apprehension of God in some sense. I think that they are mystical too. And it just seems to me that it's more than analogous. That when I use the word spiritual, for example, let's say going to New York, which I do quite often, I remember I got into trouble in a homily once. I just gotten back from New York, and I said something to the effect that I had been to the Museum of Natural History, and they had an exhibition about our early ancestors. I think it was Cro-Magnon man, and it was magnificently done. And I remember how thrilled I was by it, you know, like seeing the connection. And I also went to St. Patrick's Cathedral later, and it was really, to tell you the truth, a pretty horrible Mass that I attended. It was not too uplifting. And I said in the homily that the more spiritual experience was actually the Museum of Natural History. Now, some people took umbrage at that, and I'm sure I didn't explain it well. But what I was saying is that I don't just connect spiritual with church, hymns, rosaries and so on, but that it's a much deeper thing, that every experience can be spiritual if somehow one is in contact with God, who is sacramentally contained in that experience.
Well, my way of putting that, Roland, is to say that the most fundamental reality about us humans is we are oriented to mystery. We are encased in mystery. We live and move and swim in this one graced world. And that any experience can be the catalyst for bringing that to mind. It can be reading a good novel. It can be visiting the museum in New York, or it can be going to St. Patrick's Cathedral. The question has to do with the quality of that experience and how it resonates with your own mind and heart, and how it opens up the transcendent dimension. But all things are potentially revelatory.
Sure.
And in that sense, there is no sharp, clear distinction between secular art and religious art. That's the point that Paul Tillich, who wrote a lot about art, and one of the few theologians in the modern world who really understood the aesthetic experience or tried to write tellingly about it, although parenthetically, Karl Barth had a great feel for Mozart and always played Mozart music while he was writing, and said when he got to heaven that the first person he would look up would not be Augustine and Calvin, the great theologians, but it would be Mozart. And so that's parenthetical, but Tillich is one who wrote carefully about religion and art, and the other great Protestant theologian of the 20th century, a Lutheran, Paul Tillich, and Tillich said that you could not make this airtight distinction, that very often, and in fact in the modern world he claimed most often, it was the secular art that performed the religious function that I'm talking about, that is, to be the catalyst for raising the religious question, to be the medium for bringing us in touch with the transcendent element. So that and one of the reasons he said that is because he thought a lot of explicit religious art in the 19th and 20th century was not very good art, that it was simply became more like propaganda, or done in order to buttress the ideas of the church or something, and wasn't really authentic art. And so he was looking at the secular, so-called secular art, as being a way into the world of religion. So I guess my summary statement would be that all kinds of forms of artwork could lead us to prayer, could make us more worshipful. And everyone would have to look and say, what is it that makes me think of God? What is it about the beauty of the world that makes me feel closer to the deity? Does it happen in church, or does it happen in some other setting?
You mentioned Mozart, who is my favorite composer also. By the way, Karl Barth, I think in an essay, said that he thinks in heaven that when the angels are in the presence of the Godhead, they play Bach, but when they're off by themselves and they just want to have a good time, they play Mozart. I thought that was a cute
another
distinction.
Delightful story from Barth about Mozart.
But there's a line in Peter Schaeffer's play Amadeus about Mozart, where Salieri at one point says of some music that he's just heard by Mozart, "This was music filled with such longing, such unfulfillable longing, that it seemed to me I was hearing the voice of God." And I
remember that line from the movie, right?
Yeah, and the play also, stage play. I think that great art does that. Any experience of beauty in nature or wherever it is, that there's a longing. You somehow say, this experience, as short-lived as it is, as finite as it is, as temporal as it is, points to something that will last forever. And it has something to do with a longing inside, or as Augustine would say, that restlessness of spirit.
Don't you think that longing is for intimacy with God, finally?
For love.
Intimacy, for a love that's imperishable, for an intimacy that is satisfying, I think. Yes, and in some one way or another, the good art, the classic work of art, I guess, raises that to some consciousness, or gives us an insight into that longing, or even fulfills it or satisfies it partially in some fleeting way.
And brings about, as you said earlier, gratitude. And suddenly you stop and think about how beautiful life is and how much you have to be grateful for, and stop taking stuff for granted, which we do all the time.
Well, now let's look at the world of liturgical art, because that is part of what is supposed to be prayerful. I suppose we begin to contrast it with the older liturgies, with the Gregorian chant and with the large churches and so on. I know I was in St. Patrick's Church in Toledo for a wedding not long ago, and it just was awesome to me, the beauty of that church, and it's redone, and it really created a prayerful setting. And I've run into students who don't come to Mass at our place. We have Mass in the University Union and so on in a ordinary room, and who have said we don't come because we want to go to Mass in a church, because the church has, I suppose, a beauty about it, or a tradition, or something that lifts their spirits. Now, I'm not sure that doesn't need to be critiqued in some way. I don't just take it at face value. But on the other hand, I think it needs to be heard that somehow the church architecture can affect the way we are able to pray. And somehow the music at Mass has an influence on how well we are able to worship our God.
Oh, yeah, I have no doubt about that. I'm the chaplain regularly for 250 Adrian Dominicans up in Adrian, Michigan. And their main chapel, called Holy Rosary Chapel, is an old-style church. It's nearly a century old now, Gothic, with soaring spires. And it is a space that I love to walk in. You know, it is created specifically for a religious experience. And the windows, which are old-fashioned but very beautiful in their own way, and the way in which the pews are arranged, the very soaring quality of the architecture and the music, just a tremendous number of talented people, often original compositions and so on, you know, just gifted women. They're wonderful experiences. You know, it is so easy to think of God, you know, and to be religious, quote unquote. You know, everything there helps you to do that.
I wonder, the challenge becomes for when we are in less ornate or explicitly religious settings, are we able to somehow maintain a liturgical prayerfulness, or create a sense of worship and of God's presence? I mean, there's got to be ways to do that.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Perhaps it also is connected with beauty. I mean, are there other ways to express beauty besides having Gothic architecture?
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I know people knock very often the banner approach, but I mean, isn't it possible to have artistically fine banners that somehow help the story? Isn't it possible to have modern music, that folk music, contemporary music, that also causes the heart to reach up for God? It surely can't be only Gregorian chant that is able to do that.
Oh, no, not at all. I think what you have is a clash of theologies, so that a more puritanical approach, and you have that among Catholics, would be not to have contact, you know, not to have the handshake of peace, to try to be self-enclosed in a way. And then another more rambunctious one would be, no, let's emphasize the senses, and let's have dancing, you know, and let's have incense, and let's have music and guitars and everything. You really do have a clash of different needs, and I don't say that there's a single way to do it. I think there are a lot of ways to go to God, but for me personally, the Incarnation says that God became human, and that we are creatures of the senses, you know, and we ought to accept that and then find out how to use that well in our liturgy.
I think whenever you're in a period of transition, which we are liturgically, it's not possible to have the most developed form of arts available immediately.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
it just can't be. It takes the artist time. I mean, I think the church has to attend to this. It's probably a question of making sure that artists are compensated properly, of finding ways to get fine artists to create religious works. I know when I was down at Bowling Green State University, we used to have an annual religious art show in which there was an attempt to encourage religious artists to produce religious materials. And I think until you get a lot of that going on, you're not going to surface really quality work.
No. You have to be dedicated to it and see the arts as having value, and pay people, as you say, which many churches are not willing to do.
Yes, and so we just can't write off the liturgy as one of the catalysts for religious experience. I mean, you know, the liturgy is meant to have a beauty, and maybe just in itself, in the simplicity of the Roman liturgy, and cadences that it does preserve and so on. Maybe there's a way in which that speaks to the heart. Maybe the very rhythm of the whole celebration is still touching people, even though, we don't have beautiful stained glass windows always for people to worship with and so on.
Well, I remember a phrase that Martin Luther used about music in church being a sermon in sound, and he actually used Latin, predicatio sonora. Even if the sermon that we clerics give, or whoever gives it, is lousy, there are a lot of other things that can speak to people, like the music and like the vestments, the windows, the architecture, whatever. And so there's a lot of different ways of the arts expressing the religious experience.
Well, Roland, we've been talking here about the whole question of the spiritual life and the role of art, and we start out with the idea that it's possible for us humans to be too self-contained, to forget to be grateful for the things of life, to neglect the mystery that surrounds us. And our suggestion has been that the world of art is able to help us with that there are various artistic experiences which can lift us out of ourselves and put us in touch with the deity. And one of the major distinctions we tried to make is between secular art and religious art, and the suggestion is that they, although we distinguish them, that they get united in a strange way because they both have the power to open up the mystery dimension of life. And in the modern world, very often it seems to happen most clearly in terms of secular art, which very often has a religious dimension hidden in it. And then at the same time, we don't want to neglect the liturgical side, and I think it puts a big burden on all of us to say, how do we make our liturgies, contemporary as they are, still have a fine artistic sense so they produce an aesthetic experience? Indeed, art and the spiritual life go together, and in this case ought to open up for all of us a prayerful experience.